Processed food was a logistical solution for distribution. It entered the market as the most practical choice. The health effects took decades to become visible. This pattern suggests a larger design was at work from the start. Most people didn't question it. The changes came in waves, not revolutions. A preservative here, a processing method there, a new ingredient that extended shelf life by weeks. Each adjustment was small enough to seem reasonable. Each one built on the last. By the time the system had fundamentally changed, it no longer resembled what it had replaced. But the transition had been so gradual that few people noticed the full scope of what had shifted. The infrastructure that emerged wasn't built to nourish, it was built to scale. And scaling required standardization. Standardization required control. Control required simplification. Food that could spoil was a logistical problem. Food that varied by season or region was an inefficiency. Food that required skilled preparation was a barrier to mass adoption. So the system optimized for what it could measure: consistency, durability, cost per unit, speed of production. What it couldn't measure, or chose not to, was left out of the equation. This wasn't discussed openly. The economic incentives were clear from the beginning. A company that could produce food faster and cheaper than its competitors would dominate the market. A government that could feed its population at lower cost would face less unrest. A supply chain that could withstand disruption would be more resilient in times of crisis. These were not irrational goals, but they were goals that prioritized the system's survival over the individual's well-being. And so the system was designed to serve itself. The mechanisms were straightforward. Subsidies flowed to crops that could be grown at massive scale: corn, soy, wheat. These crops became cheap. Cheap inputs enabled cheap processing. Cheap processing enabled cheap products. Cheap products shaped consumer behavior. Consumer behavior reinforced the cycle. Within a generation, the economic architecture had locked in. Farms that once grew diverse crops for local markets consolidated into monocultures serving distant factories. Small-scale processors were replaced by industrial facilities that could run 24 hours a day. Regional food cultures gave way to national brands that offered the same product in every state, every season, every year. At the time, this was considered efficiency. The real impact appeared years later. By the time people began to notice changes in health, in energy, in the way their bodies responded to what they ate, the system was already deeply entrenched. Reversing it would have required dismantling supply chains, rewriting subsidy structures, retraining workforces, rebuilding infrastructure. The cost of undoing what had been built was far greater than the cost of continuing. So it continued. Most people never noticed this at the time, but the system wasn't designed with an exit strategy. It was designed to expand. And expansion required making food even cheaper, even more convenient, even more resistant to spoilage. Each iteration moved further from the original material. Each iteration prioritized the needs of the system over the needs of the person consuming the product. The consequences weren't immediate. That was part of the design. A food that caused harm within hours would be rejected. A food that caused harm over decades would be normalized. The delay between consumption and effect created plausible deniability. Cause and effect became harder to trace. Accountability became diffuse. And the system used that ambiguity. When questions arose, the response was predictable. More research was needed. Correlation wasn't causation. Individual choices mattered more than structural forces. The responsibility was placed on the consumer. Eat less, exercise more, read labels, make better decisions.
The system itself was rarely examined. This wasn't by chance.
The infrastructure that produced the food was the same infrastructure that funded the research, shaped the guidelines, influenced the policies. The lines between industry, science, and regulation blurred, not through conspiracy, but through alignment of interests. A food company didn't need to bribe a researcher if the researcher's funding depended on conclusions that didn't threaten the food company's product line. A regulator didn't need to be corrupt if their career advancement depended on not disrupting the industry they were supposed to oversee. The system protected itself through structure, not malice. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. A generation had grown up eating food that previous generations wouldn't have recognized as food. Taste preferences had adapted. Cooking skills had atrophied. Kitchens had shrunk. Time had compressed. The act of preparing a meal from raw ingredients had become unfamiliar, inefficient, almost quaint. And so dependence deepened. The system didn't need to force anyone, it just needed to make the alternative harder, more expensive, more time-consuming, less accessible. A person working 2 jobs didn't have the luxury of slow cooking. A family in a food desert didn't have access to fresh produce. A child raised on processed food didn't develop a taste for anything else. The system optimized for its own persistence. What's often misunderstood is that the people building this system weren't villains. They were engineers, economists, business people solving the problems in front of them. They were asked to feed more people with less cost. They were asked to reduce waste, extend distribution, stabilize supply. They succeeded. The system they built accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was what it wasn't designed to do. It wasn't designed to prioritize long-term health. It wasn't designed to preserve food culture. It wasn't designed to support small-scale producers. It wasn't designed to adapt to individual needs. It was designed to scale. And it scaled brilliantly. But scaling required removing variables. And people are variables. The system couldn't account for the fact that bodies are different, that metabolisms vary, that nutritional needs change with age, activity, environment, that food is more than fuel, that eating is more than consumption. Those complexities were inefficiencies, so they were designed out. What remained was a system that treated food as a commodity and people as units of demand. Similar decisions followed. Regulations were written to ensure safety at the point of sale, not health over a lifetime. Ingredients were approved based on acute toxicity, not chronic exposure. Serving sizes were determined by marketing considerations, not metabolic reality. The entire framework was built around short-term metrics because short-term metrics were measurable, defensible, scalable. Long-term consequences were someone else's problem. And when those consequences began to appear, rising rates of metabolic dysfunction, systemic inflammation, chronic disease, the system's response was predictable. It created new products to address the problems created by the old products. Low-fat versions of high-sugar foods, fortified versions of nutrient-depleted foods, supplements to replace what processing had removed. The system grew by solving the problems it created. This wasn't stupidity, it was logic. A system designed to maximize profit and minimize cost will always optimize for growth, not health. A system that externalizes long-term harm while capturing short-term gain will always choose expansion over correction.
A system that separates cause from consequence will always deny responsibility. And that's exactly what happened. The infrastructure became too large to question, the economic dependencies too deep to unwind, the cultural norms too embedded to challenge. What had been an experiment became the default. What had been an exception became the standard. What had been a choice became an inevitability.
By the time people began to ask whether this was the right way to feed a population, the answer no longer mattered. The system had already decided. Most people still don't realize how deliberately this was constructed. They see the products on the shelves and assume they appeared naturally, that consumer demand shaped the market, that individual choice drove the outcome. But the choices available were determined long before anyone walked into a store. The options were curated, the prices were structured, the convenience was engineered. The system was built to make certain behaviors easy and certain behaviors hard, and it worked. What's often forgotten is that this system replaced something. There was a time when food was regional, seasonal, perishable, when diets were determined by geography and climate, when knowledge of preparation was passed down through generations. That system had its own problems: scarcity, inconsistency, labor intensity. But it had a built-in feedback loop. If food made you sick, you stopped eating it. If a crop failed, you adapted. The consequences were immediate and local. The system that replaced it severed that feedback loop. Now the consequences are delayed, diffuse, and difficult to trace. A meal consumed today might affect health a decade from now. An ingredient approved this year might be banned in 20. A pattern of eating normalized in childhood might manifest as disease in middle age. The distance between action and outcome is so great that accountability dissolves. And the system depends on that dissolution. Because if the connection were clear, if the harm were immediate, if the responsibility were obvious, the system would have to change. But as long as the link between consumption and consequence remains murky, the system can continue. It can deflect, it can deny, it can shift blame to the individual while maintaining the structure that shapes individual behavior. This was structural, this was systemic, this was designed for scale, not people. And this wasn't the only change.